Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at 3 neurotic traits of Gemini. And when I was thinking about doing this particular sign, I was like, well, I'm not sure that Gemini really has a lot of neurotic traits. And then I thought to myself, what am I talking about? Because really, the true definition for me of being neurotic is a person who thinks too much about things that are kind of minuscule. They're not really that important in, their basic life, and that they kind of blow it up to make it like it's some big thing. That's probably not the most accurate definition of neuroticism, though. And I did do Virgo's version of this reading, and I think that the sign of Virgo exemplifies what I'm talking about because Virgo is ruled by Mercury. Well, so is Gemini. So it should be right up there in terms of that kind of way of, I don't even know how to say it, because it's like self-defeating patterns is probably a better kind of description, but I do think the idea of thinking too much, being in one's head too much, combined with things that I would connect with the ego. So it's like worried about what other people think of us and that sort of thing. And that distorts the person's perception of themselves, and it creates behaviors that work against us. So number one, Gemini people need stimulation and novelty. Now, why would that be neurotic? Well, the thing is that if a person believes that repeating things again and again and having familiarity with something is somehow negative, they're going to be seeking new experiences in an excessive way, or they will be very quickly bored with something. And this can produce effects that are unwanted, because relationships can suffer, for instance. And even one's goals can be abandoned when things get too routine. So there has to be the ability to cultivate a respect for or an appreciation of the things in life that are constant and not see them as the enemy. So how can this play out in just an everyday experience? Let's say somebody is a Gemini and they have escaped a serious relationship well until their late 20s. And they look around their immediate environment and they notice that all of their high school or college friends are getting married, or a lot of them, and not that they might cave to peer pressure, but they start thinking about, hey, maybe I should have a serious relationship. But one of the reasons that they haven't had one thus far is because they do tend to be a little bit commitment phobic, and the idea of the day-to-day with somebody else isn't very appealing to them, and it makes them want to run in the opposite direction. And I think that there is a little bit of truth that in some relationships there can be this kind of complacency. And I don't even think it's something like, oh, I hear a lot of advice like, oh, you have to keep your relationship fresh. And they talk about things to do. As far as I'm concerned, if you have to do things, a lot of times it's going to be contrived. It has to be like emanating from the couple themselves. to a large degree. As far as I'm concerned, I might be wrong about that, but I just think that when you're with the right person, you will normally be stimulated by that person, even if you are with them for 50 years. And certainly there are Gemini individuals who can enter into a committed relationship and remain there and sustain that interest. But you are kind of a special case. So it's very important that Gemini people are very aware of who they're getting involved with so that they don't, wake up one day and realize that they have an intellectual compatibility with that person. Especially when I say intellectual compatibility, I mean that you may be someone who is very interested in intellectual pursuits, and you're with somebody who's really not. And that other person isn't doing anything wrong. They just are not into the same thing that you are. I would say the same thing for somebody who is artistic. If there was somebody who's not, it's not to say that they can't sustain a relationship, but it's a lot easier when you both are appreciative of, you don't have to be both artists, but you can appreciate the creative process, and you have things to talk about, because we have to be able to talk to the other person. Now, some people are workaholics and they're like gone 12 hours a day. And so you don't really have to make a lot of small talk with such a person or any conversation much at all. But I'm not talking about that type of extreme situation. I'm talking about maybe the average person where you might feel very awkward if you don't have common ground. So that's number one. Number two, the tendency to make everything into something abstract. By the way, we have a rainstorm outside, but it's the summertime, so it's very warm. I have the window open. Maybe that could actually be a nice kind of a backdrop, but that's what you hear if it is picking it up. So the idea is that the air signs, and besides you, there's Libra and there's Aquarius, is that they are connected to communication and the intellect. How this plays out just in everyday events is that no matter what's happening, so let's say, especially like, I should kind of really specify the emotions, that you tend to intellectualize your emotions. That's better off saying it like that. And why is this neurotic? Well, because if you have a difficult emotion and you're very analytical about it, there's a disconnect. And that is going to possibly challenge your ability to really heal from it, because it's so abstract and it's so apart from you at a deep core level. And so the shadow formation is, there's a high possibility for that, because the person is kind of taking their rage and wrapping it up in this very precise little package that is like pretty antiseptic. And that can lead to psychological bypassing. I was joking about Libra, but I could say this about all air signs, is that they love psychotherapy because they can talk about their feelings. And you notice I said the word talk, not feel their feelings, talk about their feelings. So this is kind of in a similar vein. If you are someone who is very analytical about the feelings that you have, but especially about the difficult feelings, ask yourself, what is the payoff for that? And usually you will find that it distances you from them. Now, I'm not saying that there can never be any upside to that, because if you come from a background of trauma, it can be a saving grace to have, for instance, the moon in Gemini. I haven't been putting that in the titles, but these videos are intended for the sun and the moon. And the moon sometimes can really show up with the neurotic tendencies, because the moon represents our need for safety and how we try to obtain safety. And sometimes that can create neurotic tendencies, because, just like they say, oh, this is a safe space. There ain't no such animal in life. People who think that they can control the outer world by limiting what can be said, what can be done. That kind of thing can only exist when everybody agrees to that madness. But that is not real life. Real life is something that can, absolutely tear us to shreds sometimes, emotionally. And we have to be able to be resilient. It's not about being protected. So basically, I don't know why I started ranting and raving about that. But yeah, so I just feel like on the upside, you're able to kind of keep that distance so it doesn't really touch you at your core. But when we talk about the shadow and the people that do not acknowledge their difficult emotions, obviously it does affect them on some level. But just being able to function sometimes is superior to somebody who's totally feeling all their feelings, and it has made them a paralyzed mess where they can't do anything because they're just so they're like drowning in their emotions. So I think that it might be superior sometimes to be able to, be separate from that. But always knowing that eventually you have to face the music. Okay, number 3. And this is somewhat tied to number 2, and it has to do with always wanting to be lighthearted and joking. Gemini, one of the things, being a sun in Sagittarius, and the fact that Gemini is my opposite sign, I really love how Gemini people tend to be very witty, and it's the kind of humor that I just really dig. Now, how does that, is that something that is good or bad? Well, it isn't bad, but it can be inappropriate. There can be times when a Gemini person, or maybe a lot of times, a Gemini person likes to live on the surface of life, because, as I stated in number 2, maybe that person thinks that those difficult emotions are heavy, and they don't want to be heavy. A lot of times I depict in my thumbnails for Gemini like a fairy, because I see Gemini as this ethereal creature that is, above it all, because it's an air sign. It's not weighed down to the earth. It's not tied to the heaviness of life. And so this tends to be how Gemini people operate, where they want to be very lighthearted, jokey, and things like that. But sometimes it can be a little bit off-putting if you're trying to have a serious conversation about a very weighty topic or something. And, even when I say weighty, maybe it could even be something spiritual that involves not necessarily some kind of tragedy, but something that is more of a, I don't know what adjective to use, not a heavy topic, but profound, okay? Something that's profound. And this has to do with the house that Gemini rules, which is the 3rd house. Now, Sagittarius, the opposite sign, rules the ninth house, which is the house of higher learning and the higher mind itself, which can involve philosophy, God, yada, yada. The third house is the news, the media, the mundane mind. And when we talk about news, news is rather disposable, and it's also subject to being distorted, like, the telephone game, where, people are telling each other things, but it gets more and more distorted. By the way, here's a little thing I think Gemini people might get a kick out of, but it's, rather perverse that I did this. When I was a kid, I used to, when we would play the telephone game, I would just say a completely different sentence. I don't know what that says about me, but the whole idea of distortion is a completely different thing. That's what the game of telephone was supposed to be about, to show how things get lost in translation. People hear what they want to hear. But the third house, even when we use the word mundane, it doesn't mean that it is completely unimportant. It just is for the moment, and it also is dealing with the affairs of this world. And so if we look at this world ultimately as temporary, then the affairs of this world have only a limited amount of importance for us as souls. Embodied, for sure, in, our flesh suits, but just temporarily. So the point being that you are much more at ease, comfortable in that world that loves to talk about what is happening in the here and now, not about anything that is necessarily that lofty kind of discourse. And this, this is a generalization. Obviously, there are going to be Gemini people that are very into metaphysics and all of that good stuff. But I just wanted to point that out because it can lead to not really. Well, here's another facet of this: the jack of all trades and master of none. So knowing a little bit about a lot of things, but never really delving into something very deeply. And that can lead to kind of superficial knowledge. So even if you were to kind of pour yourself into a specific topic, that would, sustain, that would give you like depth of knowledge of that particular area, but it's very hard because of that kind of ADD mentality, that, the monkey mind, jumping from subject to subject, and so on and so forth. But again, there's definitely a brilliance in the mind of a Gemini person. It's just that they need to harness it for full effect, and then they can be more of an expert in something rather than this person that can impress people with. They can talk on a variety of topics, which not everybody can, but then they kind of reach that, they hit that wall where they can't really do that anymore. And the reason that this can be neurotic is that it's, I was going back to that idea of, kind of deliberately distracting oneself from things that are very serious and that need sometimes to be given attention. And also not to be just kind of minimized by joking about it. Sometimes other people, if they're going through something that is very heartbreaking for them, stressful for them, and a Gemini person comes along and tries to kind of make light of it, that might be, there might be times when that really is helpful. Maybe that person is taking themselves too seriously and the Gemini person is doing an actual service. But sometimes it can be that The Gemini person, it's almost like this reflex that they are actually uncomfortable dealing with serious issues, and so they tend to joke about it. We probably have all seen people who do this if you aren't really identifying with this yourself, and it can be a little bit jolting to see how people don't want to face more serious matters sometimes. And really, it's it's about not getting caught up in the drama of it, because you can comfort somebody who has just lost the love of their life a lot more effectively if you're not buying into this idea that death is permanent and, oh my God, she's never going to see him again. He's never going to see her again. They're not going to see each other. Isn't that horrible? And actually, this is something that I think happens as well. So I'm looking at the flip side of it, and some people, in their attempt to console another person because they buy into the horror of it, they end up making that person feel worse. And yeah, I was thinking about like when people say, "Oh, are you okay? Oh my God." And then you're like, "Oh, damn, I didn't feel so bad, and I guess I should feel worse about this situation." It's kind of funny how it can go to the other extreme as well. So anyway, that I could keep going on with all of these signs, but I just like to pick a few to observe how this can play out in our lives. I hope you enjoyed this. This is kind of like for fun, this series. But, if it sparks any kind of inner dialogue, that's awesome. If you'd like a private reading with me, the link is below. I'm at rainamoonastrology.com. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.